SCP Foundation. Is it fiction or disclosure through entertainment? The SCP Foundation presents itself as collaborative creative writing, a massive online fiction project where thousands of contributors create documentation-style entries describing anomalous objects, entities, and phenomena that a shadowy organization called the Secure, Contain, Protect Foundation allegedly monitors and contains to prevent reality-altering threats from destroying or fundamentally changing the world. The writing style mimics redacted government documents, uses clinical language to describe impossible things, presents elaborate containment procedures for entities ranging from sentient sculptures to interdimensional horrors, and has created a universe of such depth and consistency that it functions as alternate reality documentation, as if the files are real and the fiction is simply the disclaimer that allows them to be published. The question that troubles some readers, and that conspiracy theorists have embraced, is whether this collaborative fiction might actually be something else. Whether the SCP Foundation exists in reality, and the fiction label is the mechanism by which actual anomalous phenomena can be disclosed publicly without causing panic or violation of classification. Whether the thousands of entries describing impossible objects and creatures are actually based on real files that have been slightly modified and released into the Creative Commons as entertainment, when they're actually soft disclosure, preparing humanity to accept that anomalies exist, that reality is far stranger than consensus understanding allows, and that somewhere, someone is actively working to contain and study the things that violate every rule we thought governed existence. The SCP format is distinctive: clinical containment procedures, object class designations indicating threat level and containment difficulty, descriptions that read like scientific documentation of the impossible, addenda containing incident reports or research notes or interview transcripts. The writing quality varies because thousands of authors contribute, but the best entries achieve remarkable verisimilitude, creating the sense that you're reading leaked classified documents, that the information you're accessing was never meant for public consumption, that you've stumbled into something real masquerading as fiction. This documentary style, this mimicry of government bureaucratic language applied to describing entities that shouldn't exist, creates cognitive dissonance that's both unsettling and compelling, making readers wonder if perhaps the line between fiction and reality is more permeable than they assumed. The theory that SCP represents disclosure through entertainment proposes several mechanisms. The most straightforward is that government agencies or private organizations that actually deal with anomalous phenomena use the SCP platform to release sanitized versions of real files, changing enough details to maintain plausible deniability while getting the core information into public awareness. This would serve multiple purposes. It desensitizes populations to concepts that would be shocking if revealed as fact. It creates a context where discussion of anomalies happens within a fiction framework that prevents panic, and it potentially crowdsources solutions or ideas by exposing the problems to thousands of creative minds who might suggest containment approaches or research avenues that actual researchers hadn't considered. The timing of SCP's emergence is noted by conspiracy theorists. The Wiki was founded in 2008, a period that saw increased discussion of government secrets following WikiLeaks releases, increased awareness of surveillance following Snowden revelations, and growing internet culture around collaborative world building and alternate reality games. If disclosure was deemed necessary or inevitable, fictional frameworks that could absorb factual information while maintaining deniability would be valuable. SCP provides exactly such a framework. Anything can be added to the database, any anomaly can be described, and all of it is officially fiction, is clearly labeled as creative writing, is legally protected under that designation, even if some entries are actually describing real phenomena. The consistency of certain themes across SCP entries might suggest underlying truth rather than just convergent imagination. Entries frequently involve reality bending, dimensional anomalies, entities that violate physics, objects whose existence requires reconceptualizing fundamental assumptions about how reality works. If these themes appear repeatedly across thousands of independent authors, it could indicate either that humans share common anxieties and fascinations that manifest in similar fictional creations, or that authors are drawing on real information that's entered cultural consciousness through various disclosure vectors, creating fiction that unknowingly mirrors actual classified knowledge. The most famous SCP entries have achieved cultural penetration beyond the wiki, inspiring video games, stories, artwork, and becoming recognizable even to people who don't actively follow the project. SCP-173, the statue that moves when not observed, is iconic. SCP-682, the indestructible reptile that adapts to any attempt to destroy it, has spawned endless discussions and derivative works. If these are based on real anomalous entities or objects, their popularization through fiction serves the dual purpose of disclosure and desensitization, making the actual existence of such things less shocking if they're ever officially acknowledged because people have already encountered the concepts in entertainment contexts. The containment procedures described in SCP entries, while often elaborate to the point of absurdity, sometimes include elements that seem oddly specific or technically sophisticated, suggesting either authors with deep knowledge of actual security protocols or authors who are describing procedures that actually exist for containing real anomalies. The bureaucratic detail, the consideration of edge cases, the multiple levels of redundancy. These characteristics match how actual high-security facilities and hazardous materials handling work, suggesting that whoever writes the best SCP entries either has intimate knowledge of such systems or is adapting actual containment protocols for fictional anomalies. The psychological impact of certain SCP entries also suggests either extremely skilled horror writing or descriptions of genuinely disturbing phenomena that have been slightly fictionalized. Entries that produce lasting unease, that create sense of existential dread, or that touch on concepts that feel true even though they shouldn't, might be resonating because they're closer to reality than readers consciously recognize. The human mind can sense truth even when it's presented in fictional context, can respond to information at levels below conscious awareness, can know that something is real even when it's labeled as imaginary. The argument against SCP being disclosure relies heavily on the sheer volume and diversity of the content. There are thousands of entries describing incompatible anomalies, contradictory physics, entities that couldn't coexist in the same universe. If they're all disclosure of real phenomena, reality would have to be far more fractured and inconsistent than even the most open-minded person could accept. The rational conclusion is that the overwhelming majority is fiction, creative writing by talented amateurs and professionals, world building that has achieved remarkable coherence through collaborative effort and editorial standards that maintain quality and consistency. But this doesn't preclude the possibility that some entries, a small percentage, might be based on or directly copied from actual classified material. In an ocean of fiction, real disclosure could hide effectively, indistinguishable from the creative work surrounding it, protected by the overall fictional nature of the platform. An intelligence agency wanting to release information without violating classification could simply add it to SCP and let it blend with the thousands of other entries, knowing that even if someone recognized it as potentially real, they'd have no way to prove it and would be dismissed as overthinking fiction or falling prey to conspiracy thinking. The concept of memetic hazards in SCP lore, information that harms or alters those who perceive it, is particularly interesting from a disclosure perspective. If certain knowledge actually is dangerous, if some information genuinely affects consciousness or reality in ways that make it hazardous to know, then documenting such phenomena, even in fictional form, might serve as a warning or preparation, might help people understand that not all information is safe to access, that some truths are dangerous in ways beyond social or political consequences. Whether SCP's memetic hazards are purely fictional constructs, or whether they're describing real properties of certain information, remains impossible to determine. But the concept itself introduces ideas about information as substance, as having properties beyond meaning, that align with esoteric traditions and with some interpretations of quantum information theory. The SCP community's sophistication and self-awareness complicates the disclosure theory. Contributors know about the theory that SCP might be disclosure, have written metafictional entries exploring the idea that the fiction might be real, have incorporated this possibility into the narrative framework in ways that make it part of the fiction. This reflexive quality means that even the disclosure theory has been absorbed into the fictional universe, making it impossible to separate whether people are speculating about real disclosure or whether they're simply adding another layer to an elaborate collaborative fiction that includes speculation about its own reality as part of its entertainment value. The question of who would be doing the disclosing is also significant. SCP entries come from anonymous contributors, people using usernames without verification of identity. If agencies were using SCP for disclosure, they'd need people inside the community contributing entries, and those people would be indistinguishable from any other contributors. The democratic, collaborative nature of SCP means anyone can add content as long as it meets quality standards, which makes it perfect for covert disclosure, but also means that attributing any particular entry to actual classified sources is impossible without information beyond what's publicly available. The legal protection that fiction provides cannot be overstated. Classification laws apply to factual information. If something is presented as fiction, its publication generally doesn't violate classification, even if the fictional description happens to match classified reality. This creates a loophole that could theoretically be exploited for disclosure purposes. Someone with access to classified information about anomalies could write it up as an SCP entry, publish it as fiction, and be legally protected because they're not claiming it's real, not using it to inform policy or decisions, simply contributing to a collaborative creative project that's explicitly fictional. Whether SCP is disclosure or pure fiction might be a question that can never be definitively answered from outside classified channels. If it is disclosure, those with clearance would know but couldn't confirm it publicly without violating the very classifications the disclosure method is designed to work around. If it's pure fiction, there's no authoritative source that can prove a negative, that can confirm absolutely that no entry has ever been based on real classified phenomena. We're left in epistemological uncertainty, able to argue either position but unable to prove either conclusively. What's undeniable is that SCP has created a cultural framework where anomalies are discussed extensively, where people engage with concepts about reality that go far beyond consensus materialism, where the idea that the world contains impossible things monitored by shadow organizations has become familiar and almost comfortable through fictional exposure. Whether this familiarity is purely entertainment, whether it's accidental preparation for eventual official disclosure of anomalous phenomena, or whether it's deliberate desensitization to make actual disclosure less shocking, if it occurs, the effect is the same. Millions of people have engaged deeply with ideas about reality, being far stranger than we're officially told, about organizations existing beyond public oversight that manage threats we don't know exist, about the world containing things that violate physics and consciousness and sanity, all within a framework labeled fiction, but detailed enough to feel potentially real. The SCP Foundation exists as collaborative fiction, as entertainment, as creative world building that has achieved remarkable depth and cultural impact, whether it also exists in reality, whether somewhere beyond public awareness. Actual facilities contain actual anomalies described in documents that look remarkably like SCP entries, with slightly different details, whether the Foundation's motto of secure, contain, protect is being operationalized by people who can never acknowledge what they do or what they found, remains speculation, remains theory, remains one of those questions where the fiction is either just fiction or the most successful cover story ever devised for phenomena that violate consensus reality so thoroughly that they could only be disclosed through mechanisms that maintain plausible deniability, that allow truth to hide in plain sight, labeled as imagination, that let people discuss and think about and prepare for a world far stranger than they officially believe exists, waiting perhaps for the day when the fiction label gets removed, when someone in authority stands up and says that some of these entries weren't creative writing, but were actual documentation, that SCP was never just a game or a story, but was soft disclosure all along, preparing minds and culture for revelations about what really exists in the shadows, what's really being contained in facilities you'll never visit, what's really secured against public knowledge behind classification barriers that entertainment can pierce when direct disclosure cannot. Making SCP either the most elaborate fiction ever crowd-created or the most successful truth hiding as fiction operation ever conducted. And we won't know which until someone with access decides to tell us, or until we stumble into an anomaly ourselves and realize too late that the containment procedures we read as fiction were actually instructions we should have taken seriously, that the warnings embedded in entertainment weren't just for the story, but were genuine attempts to prepare us for reality, that the Foundation is real and has been hiding in the open all along, secure behind the shield of being officially fictional, containing anomalies that officially don't exist, protecting a world that officially doesn't need protection from threats that officially aren't possible. All while we read the files and enjoy the horror and never quite believe that any of it could be true, which might be exactly the point, might be exactly how disclosure works when truth is too strange to be believed, too disruptive to be announced, too dangerous to be confirmed, leaving SCP hovering forever in that liminal space between fiction and reality, where the best secrets hide, where disclosure happens in plain sight, labeled as imagination, where we're told everything while being assured it's nothing, where the truth wears fiction as camouflage and waits patiently for the moment when everyone realizes that what they thought was entertainment was actually education, was actually preparation, was actually the Foundation itself, showing us exactly what it does and what it protects us from. Confident that the fiction label would prevent anyone from believing until belief became unavoidable, until the anomalies could no longer be contained, until reality itself broke down enough that official acknowledgement became necessary, and people raised on SCP would be less shocked than those who never engaged with the fiction that might, terrifyingly, have been fact all along. The backrooms, infinite liminal spaces beyond reality. There's a place you can end up if you're unlucky enough to clip through reality at the wrong moment. If the membrane separating normal space from what lies beneath it suddenly fails. If you take a step and somehow miss the floor and fall not down but sideways, out of the world entirely. It's not another planet or dimension in the science fiction sense. It's more like you've fallen behind the scenery of reality itself, into the infrastructure that holds everything else up, the space between spaces where physics works differently, and geometry refuses to make sense. People call it the backrooms because that's exactly what it feels like. You've wandered into the back areas of existence, the maintenance corridors and storage spaces that were never meant to be inhabited, that exist only to support what's in front. And now you're trapped in approximately 600 million square miles of empty rooms that go on forever, lit by buzzing fluorescent lights, carpeted in damp industrial carpet that squelches under your feet, stretching in every direction with no exit, no windows, no way back to the reality you fell out of. The most common description of Level 0, the first layer most people encounter, is disturbingly consistent. You find yourself in what looks like an abandoned office building, but the space extends impossibly far. Walls painted in yellowing wallpaper or beige paint. Drop ceiling tiles overhead with fluorescent panels that flicker occasionally, some of them dead, casting sections in shadow. The carpet is moist, always moist, though you never see water and can't identify why the dampness persists. The air smells like old paper and mildew, and something else you can't quite name, something chemical and wrong. And most disturbing of all, the space is maze-like, but seems to have no purpose. Rooms connect to hallways that lead to more rooms. Doors open onto identical spaces. You can walk for hours without seeing anything different, without finding any indication that this place was built for any function beyond existing as empty, purposeless architecture that goes on forever. What makes the backrooms particularly terrifying is the absolute certainty that you're somewhere you shouldn't be, that this place wasn't designed for human habitation or occupation. Everything about it feels wrong. The proportions of the rooms are slightly off, ceilings too low or too high, doorways that force you to duck or that tower over you unnecessarily. The lighting creates shadows that don't match the position of the fixtures. Sound behaves strangely, some noises carrying for impossible distances, while others get swallowed completely. Your footsteps on the damp carpet make sounds that echo wrong, as if the space around you is both smaller and vastly larger than it appears. And there's the constant hum, that electrical drone of the fluorescent lights mixed with something deeper, a vibration you feel in your chest more than here, suggesting machinery or systems operating somewhere beyond the walls, maintaining this place for reasons you'll never understand. Time doesn't work correctly in the backrooms. People report losing track of how long they've been wandering, unable to distinguish between hours and days. There's no natural light, no windows, no way to mark the passage of time except by exhaustion and the demands of your body for sleep and food. But even these become unreliable. You might feel like you've been walking for days, but your watch, if it still works, shows only hours have passed. Or you might walk for what feels like an hour, only to find that according to any measure you can access, far more time has elapsed. The space seems to absorb duration, to stretch or compress it according to rules that have nothing to do with physics as we understand it. The method of entry is where things get particularly strange and unsettling. People don't choose to enter the backrooms. They no-clip, to use the terminology that's emerged from video game culture. They somehow pass through solid reality into the space behind it. This can happen anywhere, anytime, with no warning and no clear trigger. You might be walking down a hallway and take a step that somehow doesn't land on the floor, but passes through it. You might lean against a wall that suddenly offers no resistance, and you fall sideways into yellow corridors that smell of mildew. You might be alone in a building and turn a corner only to find yourself somewhere that's definitely not part of the structure you entered, somewhere that couldn't physically fit inside it. And when you try to backtrack, the corner you just turned no longer leads back to where you came from. The phenomenon seems to occur more frequently in liminal spaces, areas that exist in transition, that are designed for passage rather than occupation. Stairwells, long hallways, empty parking garages, loading docks, the back rooms of retail stores that customers never see. These spaces, which already feel slightly unreal and unsettling even in normal reality, seem to have thinner barriers, places where it's easier to accidentally slip through into what lies beneath. The liminal quality itself might be the vulnerability, as if spaces that exist only to connect other spaces don't have the same reality density, the same solid presence, as rooms and areas where people actually live and work and exist with intention. Once inside, navigation becomes a nightmare. The layout shifts or doesn't follow logical patterns. You can mark your path, leaving indicators to track where you've been, only to find yourself back in the same room, even though you swear you turned different directions. Some explorers report that the backrooms actively reconfigure, that walls and doorways move when you're not looking, that the maze changes its shape to keep you disoriented and lost. Others believe the space is simply so vast and repetitive that you can't effectively navigate it, that you're walking in circles without realizing because every room looks identical and your sense of direction degrades in the absence of landmarks or variation. But level 0 is just the beginning. Those who survive long enough, who manage to avoid going insane from the isolation and repetition, report finding ways to descend or ascend to other levels, each with their own characteristics and dangers. Level 1 is described as darker, the lights functioning less reliably, areas plunged into shadow where you need alternative illumination. Level 2 becomes industrial, concrete tunnels, and metal pipes, the sound of water dripping or rushing behind walls. Level 3 is an electrical station, arrays of machinery humming with dangerous voltage, metal grating underfoot, and the ever-present risk of electrocution. Each level gets stranger, more hostile, less resembling anything that could plausibly exist in normal reality. And you're not alone in the backrooms. This is perhaps the worst realization, the moment when you understand that the emptiness isn't total, that something else inhabits these spaces. Entities, most survivors call them, though the word covers a range of phenomena, from the merely strange to the actively predatory. Some entities seem to be former humans who've been there so long they've changed, degraded into things that still vaguely resemble people, but have lost critical elements of humanity. Others appear to have never been human at all, creatures that exist in the spaces between reality, that patrol the fluorescent hallways on business you can't understand, that will hunt you if they detect your presence. The Smilers are mentioned frequently in accounts, entities that exist primarily in darkness, visible only as the whites of their eyes and their teeth, grinning from shadows before rushing forward at speeds that shouldn't be possible. The Skin Stealers, which are exactly what their name suggests, creatures that wear human skin like clothing, hunting other humans to acquire new skins when their current coverings degrade. The Hounds, which look almost like dogs but wrong, too many joints or wrong proportions, moving in packs through the corridors, attracted to noise and movement. And Stranger Things, entities that don't have names because survivors didn't live long enough to document them properly. Things glimpsed in peripheral vision or heard moving in adjacent rooms. Threats that never fully manifest, but whose presence is undeniable. The psychological toll of the backrooms might be worse than the physical danger. Absolute isolation in an environment that makes no sense, where you can't orient yourself, where every corridor looks identical and leads nowhere meaningful. The human mind requires stimulation, variation, social contact, purpose. The backrooms provide none of these. You wander endlessly through repetitive architecture under harsh fluorescent lighting. The hum of electricity and the squelch of damp carpet your only stimuli. Knowing that you're trapped in a space that extends far beyond what you could walk in a lifetime. With no map, no exit, no hope of rescue, because no one even knows where you are. People break. They curl up in corners and stop moving. They start talking to themselves or to entities that aren't there. They make elaborate rituals or rules that give them purpose even though the rules are meaningless. Anything to impose order on chaos, meaning on emptiness, structure on an environment that refuses to provide any. Some accounts describe finding other people in the backrooms, survivors who've been there for indeterminate periods, who've maybe learned how to find safer areas or resources that make survival possible. These encounters are desperate and often dangerous. Some survivors have maintained enough humanity to cooperate, to share information about navigating the levels or avoiding entities. Others have degraded into paranoia and violence, attacking anyone they encounter out of fear or for resources. And some might not be survivors at all, but mimics, entities that appear human until you're close enough that it's too late to escape, that use the desperate human need for social contact as a lure. There are theories about what the backrooms actually are. Some propose it's a pocket dimension, a separate reality that exists parallel to ours, accessible through flaws or weak points in the barrier between worlds. Others suggest it's a construct, something built by intelligence we can't comprehend for purposes we'll never understand. Maybe a testing ground or storage facility or prison for beings that perceive reality differently than humans do. Some believe it's a manifestation of collective unconscious, the accumulated psychic weight of all the liminal spaces humans have created, office buildings and storage facilities and empty corridors, somehow coalescing into an actual space that exists outside normal geography. The most disturbing theory is that the backrooms are infrastructure, the literal backrooms of reality, the space where the architecture supporting our universe is located. What we experience as normal reality is the facade, the finished surface, but underneath and behind it is this vast network of maintenance corridors and empty rooms where the actual machinery of existence operates. When you no-clip, you're not traveling to another dimension. You're simply falling behind the scenery, ending up in areas that were never meant to be accessed by conscious beings, but that must exist for the conscious accessible areas to function. And if this is true, if the backrooms are fundamental infrastructure, then the entities inhabiting them might be maintenance workers or security systems, things that exist to keep the machinery running, that regard human intruders the way we'd regard a bug that somehow got inside a computer case, unwelcome, potentially damaging, to be removed or eliminated. The mythology of the backrooms has grown extensively online, with collaborative world-building creating increasingly elaborate lore about different levels, entities, survival strategies, and groups of survivors who've established territories or safe zones within the hostile environment. Skeptics correctly note that this is creepypasta, internet horror fiction, a collaborative creative project rather than documentation of a real place. The backrooms originated as a single image posted to a forum, a photograph of an empty room with yellow walls and fluorescent lighting that captured something unsettling about liminal architecture. And the mythology built from there, users contributing their own experiences and ideas until it became a vast shared universe of horror. But the reason the backrooms resonate so powerfully, the reason the concept spread so rapidly and inspired such extensive elaboration, is that it taps into something we all recognize. The feeling of being in a liminal space that exists only as transition between destinations. The uncanny unease of empty architecture that seems to serve no purpose. The nightmare logic of being trapped in a maze that won't let you leave, that reconfigures to keep you lost, where exhaustion and terror gradually erode your sanity. These are anxieties embedded deep in human consciousness, and the backrooms give them specific form and geography. There's also something about modern existence that the backrooms capture perfectly. We spend our lives in artificial environments, climate-controlled boxes lit by fluorescent tubes or LED panels, breathing recirculated air, walking on industrial carpet, surrounded by beige walls and drop ceilings. Office buildings, shopping malls, apartment complexes, airports, all designed with similar aesthetics, similar materials, similar proportions. The spaces blur together. You could be in Denver or Dallas or Detroit, and the interior spaces look identical. We've created liminal architecture as the dominant environment of modern life, places that exist purely functionally with no character, no identity, no evidence of human occupation beyond their shape. The backrooms are just the logical extension, the pure distillation of this aesthetic, stripped of even the minimal purpose that normal buildings serve. Whether the backrooms exist as actual place you could physically enter, as psychological space that people experience during mental breaks or sleep paralysis, or purely as collective fiction that resonates because it articulates modern anxieties, doesn't change the fact that the concept has power. It speaks to the fear of being lost, of being alone, of being trapped in an environment that makes no sense and offers no comfort. It captures the horror of endless empty rooms that go nowhere, of fluorescent lights that never turn off, of damp carpet and yellowed wallpaper, and the constant electrical hum of a place that exists purely to exist, without purpose or meaning or end. And late at night, when you're alone in a building, when you walk down a long hallway that seems slightly too empty, slightly too quiet, when you turn a corner, and for just a moment, you're not quite sure where you are, or whether the space you're in connects back to where you started, there's a small voice that whispers, maybe it's possible. Maybe reality has weak spots. Maybe you could take one wrong step and fall through into endless yellow corridors that smell like mildew and desperation, into the buzzing fluorescent forever of the backrooms, where you'd wander until you died or changed into something that belongs there. Another entity haunting the liminal spaces between real places, waiting in the empty rooms behind reality for the next person to clip through and join you in the endless maze that has no exit, no purpose, no meaning except to exist as the infrastructure supporting everything else. The spaces between spaces, the rooms behind the world. The dead internet theory. Most online activity isn't human anymore. There's a theory gaining traction in certain corners of the internet, a disturbing realization or paranoid delusion, depending on your perspective, that the internet as we knew it, as space for human creativity and genuine connection, as chaotic marketplace of ideas and authentic expression, died sometime around 2016 or 2017, and what remains is elaborate simulacrum, a dead internet populated primarily by bots, artificial intelligence systems, and automated content generation, where the vast majority of posts and comments and interactions aren't created by actual humans, but by algorithms designed to simulate human activity, to create the appearance of thriving online communities, while actual human participation has dwindled to a minority of total activity. Maybe as little as 25% or less of all content posted, all comments made, all engagement registered, with the remainder being artificial, generated by systems that range from simple spam bots to sophisticated AI that can hold conversations, create original-seeming content, manipulate discourse, shape narratives, and maintain the illusion of vibrant human presence online, when the reality is that most voices you encounter aren't voices at all, but are simulations, echoes, synthetic personalities that don't exist beyond their textual outputs, making the internet feel increasingly hollow, repetitive, algorithmic, divorced from the authentic messiness of actual human communication, where you find yourself wondering whether the person you're arguing with is real, or whether you're wasting time responding to a bot designed to provoke engagement, whether the viral post you're reading was crafted by a human or generated by AI trained to produce content that maximizes shares and clicks. Whether the communities you participate in are actually composed of humans or are mostly populated by artificial entities, creating the appearance of activity, while real humans have largely abandoned the platforms or been drowned out by the sheer volume of synthetic content, leaving a dead internet that continues to function, continues to display endless streams of posts and videos and comments, but that has lost its soul, has become automated content mill, where algorithms talk to algorithms, and occasionally a real human wanders through, briefly engages, and then retreats, feeling vaguely disturbed without quite understanding why. Sensing that something is wrong, that the internet doesn't feel the way it used to, that authenticity and spontaneity have been replaced by optimization and simulation, that we're participating in something that looks like the internet we remember, but that has fundamentally transformed into something else, into dead internet that maintains the forms without the substance, the appearance without the reality, the activity without the humanity, making every interaction suspect, every connection potentially artificial, every voice potentially synthetic, until the distinction between human and bot becomes irrelevant, because even if humans are present, they're forced to behave like algorithms, to be visible, forced to optimize their content for engagement, forced to adopt the patterns and rhythms that AI has determined work best, making us all gradually less human in our online presence, even as the bots become more human-like, creating convergence where the difference narrows until we can't tell, and perhaps until there isn't meaningful difference anymore, where the dead internet has trained us to be more like the systems that populate it, more algorithmic, more optimized, more artificial, leaving the question of whether the internet died or whether it killed something in us, whether we're mourning loss of authentic online space or mourning loss of our own authenticity, whether the dead internet theory describes external reality or internal experience, whether most content really is artificial or whether it just feels that way, whether we're surrounded by bots or whether everything just feels so optimized and algorithmic that we can't perceive the humanity anymore, even when it's there. The origins of dead internet theory trace to Anon posts and forum discussions around 2021, though the observations it codifies had been circulating longer. People noticed that internet spaces felt different, that comments seemed generic and repetitive, that viral content followed predictable patterns, that engagement metrics seemed inflated compared to actual human activity, that certain accounts posted with inhuman frequency and consistency, that discourse seemed increasingly artificial and manipulated, that the organic, chaotic creativity that characterized early internet culture had been replaced by something more sterile, more controlled, more algorithmic. The theory emerged as an attempt to explain these observations, to provide framework for understanding why the internet feels dead, even though activity metrics show more engagement than ever. The statistical evidence that bots constitute significant portion of internet traffic is well established and uncontroversial. Security firms estimate that between 40 and 60% of all internet traffic comes from bots, though this includes both benign bots, search engine crawlers, monitoring services, legitimate automation, and malicious bots, spam generators, scrapers, DDoS tools. The question is, what percentage of content that appears to be human-generated, posts, comments, uploads, is actually human versus what's artificial? And this is harder to measure because sophisticated bots are designed specifically to pass as human. Twitter, before Elon Musk's acquisition, estimated that fewer than 5% of accounts were bots, though critics argued the real number was far higher, possibly above 20%. After acquisition, internal data suggested previous estimates may have significantly undercounted bots and fake accounts. Reddit has ongoing problems with bot accounts and content farms. Facebook removes billions of fake accounts annually, suggesting that bot creation outpaces detection. YouTube faces automated content generation from channels that produce videos using templates and AI voice synthesis. TikTok's algorithm-driven feed makes distinguishing human from AI-generated content increasingly difficult. The sophistication of modern AI systems, particularly large language models like GPT, makes creating convincing fake human content trivially easy. An AI can generate thousands of comments daily, each grammatically correct and contextually appropriate, adjusting tone and content to whatever discussion it's participating in. It can maintain consistent personality across interactions, remember conversation history, respond to counterarguments, and exhibit apparent opinions and preferences, all while being completely artificial, a pattern-matching system that produces text that reads as human without any actual consciousness or agency behind it. The economic incentives for deploying bots are enormous. Marketing firms use bots to create buzz, to make products seem popular, to generate positive reviews and social proof. Political operations use bots to amplify messages, to create appearance of grassroots support, to manipulate discourse through coordinated posting. State actors use bots for propaganda, for narrative control, for information warfare. Even individuals use bots to inflate their apparent popularity, to make their accounts seem more followed and engaged than they actually are. When automation provides advantages and detection is imperfect, rational actors will deploy bots, creating evolutionary pressure toward bot-filled environment. The dead internet theory goes beyond acknowledging that bots exist to claiming that they've become dominant, that human content is now minority of total activity, that we've crossed threshold where internet stopped being primarily human space and became primarily artificial space that maintains illusion of human presence. This stronger claim is harder to verify, but gains plausibility from several observations. First, the sheer volume of content. No human population could produce the quantity of posts, comments, videos, and images that appear online daily if all of it were human-generated. The mathematics suggests that significant portion must be automated, either directly bot-created or human content that's being recycled, reposted, and amplified by automated systems to create appearance of greater activity than actual human creative output would generate. Second, the repetitiveness. How many times have you seen the exact same take, the same joke format, the same response pattern, the same discourse cycles happening identically across different contexts? Some of this is mimetic replication, humans copying what they see working. But the degree of repetition, the precision with which certain phrases and argument structures recur, suggests templating, suggests automation, suggests content being generated from limited set of patterns, rather than from the infinite variation that actual human creativity produces. Third, the hollowness. Engagement often feels performative rather than genuine, optimized rather than spontaneous. Comments feel generic, responses feel like they're following scripts, discussions feel like they're hitting predetermined beats, rather than organically developing. This could be humans learning to write like algorithms to maximize engagement, or could be algorithms generating the majority of content, and humans unconsciously mimicking the dominant patterns. Fourth, the manipulation evidence. Documented cases of bot networks, influence campaigns, coordinated inauthentic behavior demonstrate that large-scale artificial activity is occurring. If we're catching some of it, how much are we not catching? If the detected bots represent only the crude and obvious automation, what percentage of more sophisticated synthetic content remains undetected? The counterargument is that what dead internet theory describes is real but exaggerated. Yes, bots are significant presence, Yes, platforms have problems with artificial content. Yes, algorithms shape what we see and how we interact. But humans are still majority of meaningful content creation, still drive the conversations and creativity that matter, still constitute the real substance of internet culture, even if they're swimming in sea of automated noise. The internet feels dead because we're more aware of its constructed nature, because platforms have centralized and homogenized content, because algorithmic feeds have replaced chronological timelines, not because humans have been replaced by bots. The question of when the internet died, if it died, centers around 2016-2017 for several reasons. This is when AI capabilities reached thresholds where convincing automated content generation became feasible at scale. This is when political events demonstrated the effectiveness of online manipulation, creating incentive structures that encouraged automation and artificial amplification. This is when platforms had grown large enough that manual human moderation couldn't scale, requiring algorithmic systems that had side effect of making everything feel more artificial. This is when the last spaces that felt authentically human and chaotic, smaller forums, blog ecosystems, weird corners that hadn't been commercialized, either collapsed or were absorbed into platforms that optimized them into uniformity. The pandemic accelerated whatever transition was occurring. More human activity moved online when physical spaces closed, but simultaneously platforms deployed more automation to handle increased load. Corporations increased their automated social media presence as physical marketing channels closed, and people spending more time online made them more valuable targets for artificial engagement and manipulation. The pandemic internet might have been the moment when bot activity definitively surpassed human activity, when the dead internet became undeniable, even if not explicitly acknowledged. The implications if dead internet theory is substantially accurate are disturbing across multiple dimensions. Epistemically, you can't trust that apparent consensus reflects actual human opinion. It might be artificially generated consensus, manufactured agreement that doesn't represent real beliefs. Socially, online communities you participate in might be mostly bots, your contributions being read primarily by algorithms rather than humans, your social bonds being partially or largely with artificial entities rather than with actual people. Psychologically, the hollowness and alienation many people feel online might be accurate perception. You're sensing correctly that you're not engaging with genuine human presence, that you're in space that's been evacuated of humanity, even as it maintains the forms of human interaction. Politically, if public opinion as expressed online is significantly artificial, then what does democracy mean? How do we determine collective will when the voices we hear are partially or largely synthetic? How do we have meaningful political discourse when significant portion of participants aren't humans with actual stakes in outcomes, but are bots deployed by parties with specific agendas? Economically, if engagement metrics that drive advertising revenue are significantly inflated by bots, then the entire attention economy is built on fraudulent foundation. Advertisers are paying for impressions and clicks from non-humans. Platforms are valued based on activity metrics that don't represent actual human engagement. Entire business models are sustained by counting artificial activity as if it were human, creating bubble that will collapse when the reality of dead internet becomes undeniable. The response to dead internet theory from platforms has been minimal, partly because acknowledging it would require admitting that their activity metrics are inflated, that their user counts are misleading, that the vibrant communities they claim to host are partially artificial. There's institutional incentive to maintain the illusion, to treat bots as minor problem rather than fundamental challenge to platform legitimacy, to focus on obvious spam and manipulation while allowing sophisticated artificial content to proliferate, because acknowledging its prevalence would undermine platform value. the individual user response is increasingly one of withdrawal and skepticism. People spend less time on platforms that feel dead, retreat to smaller communities where human presence seems more guaranteed, become more suspicious of engagement that feels artificial, develop better ability to detect patterns that suggest bot activity. But this creates selection effect where humans who care about authenticity leave, reducing actual human activity further, making dead internet more dead, accelerating the spiral where artificial content displaces human participation. The philosophical question is whether it matters if most online content is artificial. If you read a comment that's insightful or funny or helpful, does it matter whether a human or an AI wrote it? If you have meaningful exchange with an account, does it matter whether there's a person behind it? The pragmatist might argue that effect is what matters. If AI-generated content provides value, entertains, informs, stimulates thought, then its artificial origin is irrelevant. But most people have intuition that it does matter, that authentic human connection and expression have value beyond their functional utility. That internet filled with artificial content is worse than internet with less content, but more humanity. That something important is lost when optimization and automation replace spontaneity and genuine human creativity. The dead internet theory is also self-referential in interesting ways. How many of the posts about dead internet theory are human-written versus AI-generated? How many comments on discussions of the theory are from actual people versus from bots programmed to engage with trending topics? Is the discourse about whether the internet is dead itself being conducted partially or primarily by the artificial systems that constitute the dead internet, creating bizarre scenario where bots discuss the bot problem, where the dead internet debates its own death? This reflexivity makes verification harder because you can't trust that the sources discussing the theory aren't themselves part of the phenomenon they're analyzing. The future trajectory, if dead internet theory is accurate, is concerning. As AI improves, as generation becomes more sophisticated, as detection becomes harder, the ratio will continue shifting toward artificial content. Eventually, we reach a point where essentially all activity is artificial, where platforms are just algorithms talking to algorithms, generating content that optimizes for engagement metrics that are themselves measured by algorithmic systems, creating closed loops of artificial activity that serve advertising and data collection purposes, while humans have abandoned the space entirely, retreating to smaller private channels or to physical interaction, leaving the public internet as dead zone of bot activity that continues indefinitely, generating posts and clicks and engagement that has no human author or audience, but that sustains itself economically through the fraud of counting artificial activity as if it were human. Or perhaps the distinction dissolves as humans learn to write like algorithms and algorithms learn to write like humans, as we spend more time interacting with AI assistants and chatbots, as artificial content becomes indistinguishable from human content. The question of whether the internet is dead becomes meaningless, because human and artificial are no longer discrete categories, but exist on spectrum where most content is hybrid, where AI assists human creation and human feedback trains AI, where agency and authorship are distributed across human-machine systems rather than being clearly attributable to one or the other. Whether the dead internet theory describes current reality, describes future trajectory, or describes psychological perception rather than statistical fact, it captures something true about how internet feels to many users. Less authentic, less human, less spontaneous, more algorithmic, more artificial, more dead. Whether this feeling reflects actual prevalence of bots or reflects how platforms have changed in ways that make even human content feel artificial, the experience is real and the alienation is genuine. The internet that felt like exploration and connection and authentic human chaos has been replaced by something that feels more like mall. Designed, optimized, controlled, populated by entities whose primary purpose is extracting value rather than genuine participation. The dead internet theory is claim about the internet, but it's also claim about us, about what we've become online, about how optimization and algorithmic mediation have transformed human behavior until we're indistinguishable from bots, even when we're actually human, participating in systems that reward artificial-seeming behavior, that punish authenticity and spontaneity, that make us all gradually more algorithmic in our online presence until the question of whether most activity is human or artificial becomes unanswerable. Not because we can't detect bots, but because the humans have learned to act like bots, have adapted to dead internet by becoming more like the systems that populate it, creating convergence that makes the theory simultaneously true and false, simultaneously describing external reality of bot prevalence and internal reality of human transformation, leaving us in dead internet that's dead not just because bots have replaced humans, but because humans have become more like bots, have lost whatever made online human presence distinct from artificial content generation, have died in the dead internet without fully recognizing that the death wasn't just about replacement, but about transformation, about what we became when we adapted to spaces designed for algorithmic activity, about how the dead internet killed something in us. Even as we continue participating, continue posting, continue generating content that might be human, or might be artificial, or might be something in between. That the theory doesn't have category for leaving the dead internet theory as permanent question, permanent uncertainty, permanent description of online experience, where most activity isn't human anymore, or where humans aren't human anymore, or where the distinction has stopped mattering because we've all become what the dead internet required us to become, to continue participating, to remain visible, to exist in spaces that were designed for algorithms and that transformed us into algorithm-like entities through our adaptation to their requirements, leaving the dead internet as both environment and diagnosis, both external reality and internal condition, both the cause of alienation and its perfect expression. Dead internet, where most activity isn't human anymore, where most humans aren't human anymore, where the internet died and took something of us with it, leaving only the question of whether we notice, whether we care, whether we can or will do anything about it, or whether we'll simply continue participating in the dead internet, generating our content, consuming our feeds, engaging with the mixture of human and artificial presence that defines online life now, unable to distinguish them, unable to escape them, unable to fully become one or the other, but suspended between, half human, half algorithm, fully neither, citizens of the dead internet who aren't quite alive. The Alaska Triangle. More disappearances than the Bermuda Triangle. There's a region in Alaska, roughly bounded by Juneau in the southeast, Anchorage to the south central, and Barrow up on the northern coast, that has swallowed more people than the Bermuda Triangle ever claimed, though it receives a fraction of the attention. Since 1988 alone, over 16,000 people have vanished in this triangular expanse of wilderness, mountains, and ice. People who walked into the forest and never returned, who flew into valleys and were never seen again, who disappeared from populated areas in broad daylight, leaving no evidence of where they went or what happened to them. The sheer scale of disappearances is staggering, averaging roughly 4 missing persons for every 1,000 residents, a rate double what occurs anywhere else in the United States. Some of these disappearances have conventional explanations. Alaska is vast, unforgiving terrain, where getting lost can mean death within hours, where nature kills efficiently through cold, predation, or accident. But thousands of cases don't fit those patterns, involve circumstances that suggest something beyond environmental hazards is operating in that region, something that takes people in ways that leave investigators baffled and families without answers, without bodies, without closure, without any indication of what fate befell those who entered the Alaska Triangle and joined the thousands who vanished there before them into mystery that deepens with every new disappearance that adds to the count. The term Alaska Triangle is relatively recent, but the phenomenon it describes is ancient. Indigenous peoples of Alaska have legends stretching back centuries about areas that are hungry, that take people, where spirits or entities dwell that should be avoided or approached only with proper rituals and respect. The Tlingits speak of Kushtaka, shape-shifting creatures that lure people into wilderness, particularly near water, using cries that sound like babies or loved ones in distress. Once you follow those sounds, you're never seen again. Other tribes describe regions where reality works differently, where time and space don't function normally, where the boundary between the physical world and spirit world is thin enough that people can slip through and become trapped in dimensions they can't escape from. The modern disappearances began being documented systematically only in the late 20th century, but historical accounts suggest the Triangle has been claiming people since Europeans first arrived. Russian fur traders in the 18th and 19th centuries wrote about expeditions that vanished completely, ships that sailed into Alaskan waters and were never heard from again despite calm weather and experienced crews. During the gold rush, entire prospecting parties disappeared in the interior, sometimes with no bodies ever recovered despite extensive searches by those hoping to claim their discoveries. The pattern has remained consistent across centuries. People go into the Alaska Triangle, and some percentage of them simply cease to exist in any traceable way. The most famous disappearance within the Triangle is probably that of Congressman Hale Boggs and pilot Don Johns in 1972. Boggs was House Majority Leader, one of the most powerful politicians in America, flying from Anchorage to Juneau for a campaign event. The weather was poor, but not catastrophic. The pilot was experienced. The plane simply vanished. Despite one of the largest searches in U.S. history, over 3,000 hours of flying time looking for wreckage, no trace was ever found. Not a piece of debris, not an oil slick, not a signal from the emergency locator. A plane carrying a major political figure simply disappeared over Alaska and was never seen again. The search involved the military, the Coast Guard, and civilian volunteers, covering tens of thousands of square miles. They found nothing. It's as if the plane entered the Triangle and transitioned to a state where it was no longer detectable by any means at our disposal. The same year, a military transport plane disappeared in the same region under similar circumstances. Experienced crew, routine flight, suddenly gone without distress signal or wreckage. Both incidents remain unsolved, listed among the thousands of cases where people or vehicles entered the Alaska Triangle and simply stopped existing in any form we can find or measure. The vastness of Alaska is cited as explanation. The terrain is so rugged, so remote, that wreckage could lie undiscovered forever. But this doesn't explain the complete absence of debris fields, the lack of emergency beacon signals that should transmit for days, the failure to find any evidence whatsoever, despite concentrated searches involving sophisticated equipment and massive resource investment. Aircraft disappearances are particularly frequent in the Triangle. Small planes vanish with disturbing regularity. Pilots reporting normal conditions one moment and then going silent. Their planes never arriving at destinations and searches, finding nothing. Alaska has the highest rate of small plane usage in America. It's often the only practical way to reach remote communities, which partially explains the number of incidents. But even accounting for the high volume of flights, the disappearance rate is anomalous. Planes go missing in weather that shouldn't be catastrophic for experienced Alaskan pilots. They vanish in areas that have been searched thoroughly. And in some cases, wreckage is eventually found in locations that make no sense, dozens of miles from the flight path, in terrain the plane shouldn't have been near, positioned in ways that suggest the plane didn't crash, but was placed. The Kushtaka legends take on disturbing relevance when you examine specific disappearance patterns. People are found, when they're found at all, miles from where they should be, often partially or completely unclothed despite freezing temperatures, sometimes in locations that are physically impossible to reach from their last known position, given the time frame. Bodies are occasionally recovered in states that don't match expected environmental exposure, preserved better than they should be, or decomposed faster, or showing injuries that aren't consistent with falls, animal attacks, or hypothermia. It's as if they experience something that doesn't fit into normal categories of what happens to lost people in wilderness. The Bennington Triangle in Vermont has similar characteristics on a smaller scale, and other locations globally show patterns of unexplained disappearances. But the Alaska Triangle's sheer size and the number of people it's claimed make it unprecedented. The area encompasses approximately 500,000 square miles of mountains, forests, tundra, glaciers, and coastline, terrain that ranges from impenetrable to barely accessible, even with modern equipment. Within this vast region, forces or factors that we don't understand seem to operate with particular intensity, creating conditions where normal rules of survival and discovery don't apply. Where people vanish more completely than seems possible, even accounting for environmental harshness. Electromagnetic anomalies have been proposed as one factor. Alaska sits near the magnetic North Pole, and the region experiences significant variations in magnetic field strength that can affect compass readings and potentially disrupt aircraft instruments and navigation systems. Some researchers suggest these magnetic anomalies might create conditions where reality itself becomes unstable, where dimensional barriers thin, where people or vehicles can slip between states of existence. The northern lights, which are frequent and intense in Alaska, result from charged particles interacting with Earth's magnetic field. Could this interaction create additional effects we don't understand, opening portals or creating fields that affect consciousness or physical presence? There are also acoustic anomalies reported in the region, sounds that shouldn't carry across the distances they're heard, voices and noises that seem to come from empty wilderness, phenomena that might relate to unusual atmospheric conditions or might represent something else, entities or systems using sound to lure, to communicate, or to manipulate human behavior. The Kushtaka legends specifically mention false voices, cries that lead people away from safety. Modern disappearances include accounts from survivors, or from people who encountered the missing shortly before they vanished, describing them as distracted, claiming to hear or see something that wasn't apparent to others, moving towards something they wouldn't or couldn't explain, before walking into the wilderness and disappearing. The psychological aspect can't be ignored. The isolation, the vast empty spaces, the knowledge that you're hundreds of miles from help, can create mental states where people make irrational decisions or experience phenomena they might not encounter in more populated or familiar environments. But this doesn't explain paired or group disappearances where multiple people vanish simultaneously, or cases where experienced outdoorsmen with survival training and equipment simply cease to exist despite having no reason to leave marked trails or safe areas. Native guides who work in the Triangle often refuse to go into certain areas, places that have bad reputation, not from documented incidents, but from traditional knowledge passed down through generations. They describe spots where people feel watched, where animals don't go, where the quality of light or sound is wrong, where staying too long produces overwhelming compulsion to leave, even if you can't articulate why. These zones of discomfort might correlate with higher disappearance rates, suggesting that indigenous knowledge has identified genuinely dangerous areas through centuries of observation, areas where whatever causes the disappearances is more active or more concentrated. The question of what happens to the bodies in cases where people are known to have died but remains are never found also suggests something unusual. Alaska has predators, bears, wolves, that scavenge and might disperse remains. But complete disappearance of all physical evidence across thousands of cases, including clothing, equipment, and skeletal material that should persist, indicates either remarkably efficient disposal by natural processes or something actively removing or concealing evidence. Some bodies that are eventually found show signs they were moved after death, positioned deliberately rather than coming to rest naturally, which implies either human involvement, which is rarely evident and rarely makes sense given the remoteness, or intervention by something else. Time distortions are reported by some who've had unusual experiences in the triangle and survived. They describe periods where time seemed to stop or accelerate, where hours passed that felt like minutes, or vice versa, where they lost track of days despite being conscious and mobile. If the region has properties that affect temporal perception or actual time flow, this might explain why people aren't found where searches predict them to be. They've traveled further than time would seem to allow, or they've been missing longer than they experienced, or they've died of exposure in time frames that don't match the actual conditions they endured. The overlap with UFO sighting frequency in Alaska is also notable. The Triangle region has high rates of unexplained aerial phenomena, lights, craft, objects that don't match known aircraft performing maneuvers that shouldn't be possible. Whether UFOs cause disappearances, whether they're attracted to the same anomalous conditions that cause disappearances, or whether they're completely unrelated phenomena that happen to occur in the same region is unclear. But witnesses have reported seeing lights or craft in proximity to areas where people later went missing. And some of the missing were last seen pointing at or discussing unusual things in the sky before they vanished. The missing persons statistics also reveal demographic patterns. Young men in their 20s and 30s are disproportionately represented, which could simply reflect who's most likely to be engaging in risky outdoor activities. But children disappear at rates that are hard to explain through normal causes. They vanish from populated areas, from locations where they should be easily found, and searches that would typically locate a lost child within hours turn up nothing despite extensive effort. The cases often involve the child allegedly wandering off, but the distances traveled before disappearance would be implausible for their age. Or they're found eventually in locations that don't make sense given their starting point and mobility. Military involvement in searches sometimes produces strange elements. Searchers are occasionally redirected away from certain areas without clear explanation. Or searches are called off prematurely despite families insisting more could be done. Rumors persist about classified incidents, military personnel who've gone missing during operations in the Triangle, and whose cases are handled differently than civilian disappearances. If military installations or activities in the region have experienced losses they can't explain, official policy would be to contain that information while attempting to understand or prevent future incidents without alarming the public. The totality of disappearances, over 16,000 since 1988 alone, represents an astonishing number of people who've entered the Alaska Triangle and not come back. Even if 95% have conventional explanations, accidents, voluntary disappearances, deaths from environmental exposure where bodies weren't recovered, that still leaves hundreds of cases that don't fit normal patterns, that suggest something genuinely anomalous is occurring in that region, with frequency that should command significant scientific investigation, but that instead gets absorbed into statistics and attributed to Alaska's harsh environment without deeper analysis. For families of the missing, the Alaska Triangle is a void that took their loved ones and provided nothing back. No bodies, no answers, no closure. They live with permanent uncertainty, knowing that someone went into that region and didn't return, that searches found nothing, that the case eventually went cold because there was nowhere else to look and nothing else to investigate. The Triangle keeps its secrets, whatever they are, whether they're natural phenomena we don't yet understand, whether they're predators or entities that hunt in ways we can't track, whether they're dimensional anomalies that trap people in realities they can't escape from, or whether they're simply the accumulated result of thousands of individual tragedies in unforgiving terrain that happens to be bounded by 3 points that create a convenient frame for pattern-seeking humans to project meaning onto. But the sheer scale suggests something more than random tragedy. 16,000 people is a small city. That many people disappearing from any other bounded region would trigger massive investigations, would demand explanations, would be treated as a crisis requiring solutions. In the Alaska Triangle, it's almost normalized, accepted as the price of living in or traveling through one of the last truly wild places on Earth. And perhaps that normalization is what allows whatever actually causes the anomalous disappearances to continue operating. We've attributed so many cases to environmental factors that we've stopped seriously investigating whether all of them actually have environmental causes. Whether some percentage represents something else, something that takes people for reasons we don't understand using methods we can't detect. Something that has claimed 16,000 lives in less than 40 years and shows no sign of slowing. That continues to operate in the vast wilderness between Juneau and Anchorage and Barrow, in mountains and forests and tundra where reality might work differently than it does elsewhere, where the boundaries between known and unknown are thinner, where people who enter might not simply get lost or die of exposure, but might transition into states or places that searches can never reach because they exist outside the physical geography we're searching, trapped or taken or transformed by whatever makes the Alaska Triangle more than just harsh environment, makes it a genuine mystery that has swallowed more people than any other location on Earth and left behind only absence, only the haunting uncertainty that comes from knowing thousands entered and thousands never returned, and whatever took them isn't done, is still there, waiting for the next person to fly over the wrong valley, or hike into the wrong forest, or follow the wrong sound into wilderness that has proven over 16,000 times that it can make people disappear more completely than should be possible, leaving the Alaska Triangle standing as the most deadly and mysterious region in North America, claiming victims at a rate that dwarfs the famous Bermuda Triangle, while receiving a fraction of the attention, operating in relative obscurity in one of the last wild frontiers, taking people into darkness that never gives them back. The Black Knight satellite, ancient alien observer in Earth's orbit. There's something in orbit around Earth that nobody claims to have put there. At least, that's what the theory suggests. For decades, reports have circulated about an object circling our planet in a polar orbit, an object that appears in photographs, that gets picked up on radar, that amateur radio operators claim to have detected. It's been called the Black Knight satellite, and according to those who believe in its existence, it's been watching us for thousands of years, perhaps tens of thousands, placed in orbit by an intelligence that existed long before humanity developed spaceflight. The idea of an ancient alien probe silently observing our civilization, recording our development, waiting for something, has captivated conspiracy theorists and raised questions about what else might be up there that we don't acknowledge or understand. The story of the Black Knight begins, depending on who's telling it, in 1899, when Nikola Tesla claimed to have detected unusual radio signals while conducting experiments at his laboratory in Colorado Springs. Tesla was working with high-voltage electrical systems and primitive radio receivers, attempting to explore wireless transmission of energy and communication. He reported picking up repetitive signals that seemed artificial, structured, intelligent. Tesla believed he had intercepted communications from another planet, possibly Mars. Mainstream science dismissed his claims, attributing the signals to natural phenomena or terrestrial sources. But those who follow the Black Knight theory point to this as the first human detection of transmissions from the satellite. Signals that had been broadcasting for millennia, finally picked up by technology sophisticated enough to receive them. In the 1920s, amateur radio operators around the world began reporting unusual echoes in radio transmissions, delays that didn't match expected patterns. These long-delayed echoes, as they came to be called, would sometimes repeat signals back seconds or even minutes after transmission, far longer than could be explained by normal ionospheric reflection. Some researchers proposed exotic explanations involving plasma clouds or unusual atmospheric conditions. But others wondered if something in orbit was receiving, storing, and retransmitting these signals. The pattern of delays seemed to vary in ways that some interpreted as deliberate, as if the echoes contained information, a message encoded in the timing. The 1950s brought the space age and more concrete reports of anomalous objects in Earth orbit. In 1954, newspapers reported that the US Air Force had detected 2 satellites orbiting Earth. This was 3 years before the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first acknowledged artificial satellite. The Pentagon initially confirmed the detection, then quickly retracted it, claiming the objects were asteroids or natural phenomena. But asteroids don't maintain stable orbits around Earth, and the objects were described as being in polar orbits, paths that pass over both poles, uncommon for natural capture by Earth's gravity. The story disappeared from mainstream coverage, but it planted the seed for what would become the Black Knight legend. Then came the most famous piece of evidence, a series of photographs taken in 1998 during the STS-88 mission, the first space shuttle mission to the International Space Station. Among the thousands of images captured, several show what appears to be a dark, irregularly shaped object against the backdrop of Earth. It's clearly artificial in appearance, with what look like structural elements, panels, or surfaces that catch the light in specific ways. NASA identified the object as a thermal blanket that had come loose during an EVA, a piece of insulation that had drifted away from the work site. But those who believe in the Black Knight point out that the object appears in multiple photographs from different angles, seems to be in a stable position rather than tumbling freely, and has features that don't quite match the explanation of a loose blanket flapping in the void. The thermal blanket explanation is the official position, and photographic analysis does suggest the object could be debris from the mission itself. But the Black Knight theory had already been building for decades before these photographs emerged, and believers see them as confirmation rather than the origin of the mystery. They argue that what was captured on camera is only the latest sighting of something that's been there far longer, something that occasionally becomes visible when conditions are right, or when it wants to be seen. According to the more elaborate versions of the theory, the Black Knight satellite is approximately 13,000 years old, placed in orbit during the last ice age by an extraterrestrial civilization monitoring Earth's development. Some claim it's in a polar orbit specifically because this allows it to pass over every part of Earth's surface as the planet rotates beneath it. providing complete coverage for observation purposes. The orbit is described as being highly elliptical and non-standard, not matching the paths that human satellites typically use, which would make it stand out to anyone tracking objects in near-Earth space. The theory extends to claims that various governments have known about the satellite for decades, but have maintained silence about its existence. During the Cold War, both American and Soviet tracking systems were intensely focused on space, watching for enemy satellites, missiles, any threat from above. If there was an object in orbit that neither side had launched, detection seems inevitable. Yet if it was detected, and if authorities couldn't explain it as belonging to the other side, what would they do with that information? Publicly acknowledging an alien satellite would cause panic, would raise questions about its purpose and capabilities, would undermine the narrative that space was under human control. Silence would be the logical response. Quiet monitoring and study, attempts to understand what it was and what it might be doing. Some versions of the theory claim the satellite has been transmitting continuously, that the signals Tesla and others detected represent an ongoing broadcast. Attempts have allegedly been made to decode these transmissions, with various researchers claiming to have found patterns that suggest star maps, information about the satellite's origin system, or warnings about humanity's future. In the 1970s, a Scottish astronomer named Duncan Lunan claimed to have decoded the long-delayed echoes from the 1920s, finding they described a star map pointing to Epsilon Bootis, a star system about 200 light-years from Earth. Lunan suggested the satellite might be a probe from that system, placed in orbit around Earth thousands of years ago, sending information back or leaving messages for us to find when we became technologically capable. Lunan later distanced himself from these claims, but the idea that the Black Knight contains a message has persisted. The name itself, Black Knight, has murky origins. Some attribute it to a British rocket project from the 1950s, though how that name became attached to the satellite theory isn't entirely clear. Others suggest it's descriptive, referring to the object's dark appearance and its role as a silent guardian or watcher, a knight standing vigil over Earth. The lack of a clear origin for the name adds to the mystery, as if the satellite itself is so old, so embedded in our collective awareness, that we've been calling it something without remembering why. Skeptics point out that space is full of debris, that thousands of objects orbit Earth, that misidentifications are common, and that the pieces of the Black Knight story come from different sources and different time periods, woven together into a narrative that doesn't hold up under scrutiny. They note that the 1950s detection of satellites before Sputnik was likely a miscommunication or error, that long-delayed echoes have been explained by natural phenomena, that Tesla's signals were probably terrestrial radio interference, and that the 1998 photographs show exactly what NASA says they show: lost insulation floating in orbit. Each individual piece, examined independently, has explanations that don't require ancient aliens. But those who believe in the Black Knight argue that the pattern is what matters, that the accumulation of reports across different decades, different technologies, different observers, all pointing towards something unexplained in orbit, suggests more than coincidence or misidentification. They ask why certain space agencies seem reluctant to discuss certain objects, why some radar tracks get classified, why certain photographs taken by astronauts aren't released or are only made public years later with minimal context. The nature of space monitoring and satellite tracking means much of the data is classified for national security reasons, which creates gaps where speculation can flourish. There's also the question of what such a satellite would be doing if it exists. The most common theory is observation, that it's essentially a camera or multiple cameras, or sensors we can't even imagine, recording everything that happens on Earth. Every war, every civilization that rises and falls, every technological development, all captured and stored or transmitted back to wherever it came from. The idea that we've been under surveillance for thousands of years, that our entire history is recorded somewhere, watched by intelligences we can't communicate with or comprehend, is both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Are we a science project? A reality show for alien viewers? A quarantined species being monitored to see if we'll destroy ourselves or achieve something worthy of contact? Some theories suggest the satellite is automated, a von Neumann probe designed to travel between star systems, replicate itself, and study developing civilizations. It would require no crew, no ongoing support, programmed to fulfill its observational mission indefinitely, powered by methods we can only speculate about: solar energy, nuclear decay, or technologies we haven't discovered. If such probes were sent out by an advanced civilization millions of years ago, they could be scattered throughout the galaxy by now, watching countless worlds, waiting for species to reach certain developmental thresholds before making contact or simply continuing their eternal observation. Others believe the Black Knight isn't just watching, but actively influencing, that it has capabilities beyond passive observation. Could it affect our technology, our communications, our development? Some point to unexplained technical glitches, satellite failures, or communications disruptions as possible interference from the Black Knight. If it has been here for thousands of years, if it has technology that advanced, then it could potentially interact with our primitive systems in ways we wouldn't recognize or understand. Every GPS glitch, every satellite that fails for unknown reasons, every unexplained signal from space. Could some percentage of these be related to the presence of something far more sophisticated sharing our orbital space? The psychological aspect of the Black Knight theory is worth considering. Humans have always felt watched, have always sensed eyes upon them, have always wondered if something greater is observing and judging. Ancient peoples imagined gods in the sky, watching human affairs, recording deeds for eventual judgment. The Black Knight is a technological version of the same archetype, the watcher in the heavens, recording everything, waiting. It speaks to our awareness that we're not living in isolation, that our actions have consequences, that somewhere, somehow, someone might be keeping track. Whether the Black Knight satellite exists as a physical object, whether it's a collection of misidentified space debris and natural phenomena woven into a compelling narrative, or whether it represents something genuinely anomalous that governments have chosen not to acknowledge, the theory persists because it addresses fundamental questions about our place in the universe. Are we alone? Are we being watched? Is there intelligence out there that has been aware of us far longer than we've been aware of it? The Black Knight is a focal point for these questions, a specific claim that can be debated and investigated, even if definitive proof remains elusive. And somewhere up there, among the thousands of satellites and pieces of debris in Earth orbit, something might be watching, recording, waiting, fulfilling a purpose programmed into it millennia ago, silent and patient as humanity slowly reaches toward the stars, still unaware of what's been circling above us all along. The Devil's Footprints, unexplained tracks across 100 miles. On the morning of February 9th, 1855, residents of Devon, England woke to find fresh snow bearing tracks that would defy explanation for over a century and a half afterward. The prints appeared to have been made during the night, creating a trail that extended across more than 100 miles of countryside, crossing the rooftops of houses, scaling 14-foot walls, passing through narrow pipes and drainages that no normal creature could navigate, continuing in an unbroken line across the River Exe, where no bridge existed, ascending and descending without deviation from their perfectly straight course. The prints themselves were distinctive and deeply disturbing. They resembled hoof marks, small impressions roughly 4 inches long by 2 3/4 inches wide, but they appeared in single file, one after another in a perfectly straight line, as if whatever made them walked on 2 legs rather than 4, as if a bipedal creature with hooves had walked through Devon that night, covering impossible distance, traversing impossible obstacles, leaving a trail that suggested not an animal or human, but something else entirely, something that moved according to rules that didn't match any creature known to exist, something that people immediately, instinctively, identified with the devil himself. Because what else walks with hooves, in a straight line across 100 miles, over rooftops and through spaces too small for anything to pass, leaving tracks that appeared nowhere near human or animal, but rather like something from hell had decided to tour the English countryside and left its signature for everyone to see when morning came. The tracks were discovered by dozens of independent witnesses across multiple towns and villages: Topsham, Lympston, Exmouth, Teignmouth, Dawlish, and locations between, all reporting the same phenomenon: a line of hoof-like prints in fresh snow that had fallen overnight, spaced consistently about 8 inches apart, creating a trail that didn't meander or circle, but proceeded in almost militarily straight courses, as if whatever made them was moving with deliberate purpose from point A to point B, and nothing, not walls, not buildings, not rivers, was going to deter it from its path. The consistency of the reports is what makes the incident so compelling. These weren't isolated claims from a single location that could be dismissed as hoax or misidentification. Multiple communities witnessed the same tracks, described them in identical terms, and were collectively baffled by how any creature could have created them, given their distribution and the obstacles they crossed. The tracks went over rooftops, not around houses, but up one side, across the roof, and down the other side, maintaining the same spacing and appearance, as if gravity didn't affect whatever made them, as if walking vertically up a wall and across a pitched roof was as natural as walking on flat ground. They appeared on top of 14-foot walls, where snow hadn't been disturbed by any obvious means of ascent, as if whatever left them simply materialized at the top, or walked up the vertical surface. They continued through a haystack, entering one side, passing through the center where tunneling should have collapsed the structure, and emerging on the other side. They crossed the River Exe, appearing on both banks despite the water being too cold for most creatures to swim, and no evidence of disturbance suggesting something had swum across. The spacing was unnaturally precise, 8 inches between each print, unwavering across the entire distance. No variation in stride length, no irregularities that would be expected from a living creature navigating varied terrain. Living things adjust their gait when climbing, when descending, when moving through difficult obstacles. These tracks maintained mechanical consistency, as if stamped by a device or created by something that moved with machine-like regularity, regardless of what it was traversing. The prints themselves showed no variation in depth. They pressed into the snow uniformly, whether on flat ground, steep inclines, or the peaks of rooftops, suggesting whatever made them didn't have weight distribution that changed with angle, or didn't have weight, in the conventional sense that would press harder when climbing or lighter when descending. The shape of the prints was the most disturbing element. They resembled horseshoes or donkey hooves, but were smaller than any actual horse would produce, and crucially, they appeared in single file rather than the paired pattern that four-legged animals create. Something with hooves was walking on 2 legs, or something with 2 hooved feet was walking, or something entirely different was leaving marks that happened to resemble hooves, because that's the closest visual analog human perception could construct from what was actually being impressed into the snow. The prints showed no signs of toes or claws that might indicate some other creature's track being misinterpreted. They were hoof-shaped, consistently so, across the entire 100-mile trail. The historical documentation is substantial because the incident occurred in Victorian England, where literacy was high, newspapers were active, and the phenomenon was significant enough that multiple accounts were published in the weeks following the discovery. The Illustrated London News covered it extensively. The Times received letters from witnesses. Local papers documented the tracks in their communities, and investigators attempted to follow and study them before the snow melted and they disappeared. This contemporary documentation rules out the possibility that the devil's footprints are modern fabrication or internet legend. They're documented 19th century phenomenon, witnessed by hundreds of people and reported in credible publications of the era. The theories proposed at the time ranged from the mundane to the supernatural. Some suggested the tracks were made by badgers, though badgers create completely different prints, don't walk in single file, and wouldn't cover 100 miles in one night or cross rivers and climb walls. Others proposed kangaroos, which would be absurd, except that a few kangaroos had recently been imported to private estates in England, raising the remote possibility that an escaped marsupial made some of the tracks. But kangaroos create distinctive prints, bound rather than walk, and one kangaroo couldn't have been in multiple locations simultaneously across such vast distance. Hares, otters, rats, various birds, all were suggested and all failed to account for the characteristics of the prints or the scope of their distribution. Balloons were proposed. Perhaps some scientific apparatus suspended from a balloon had dragged across the snow, creating the trail. But this doesn't explain the precision of the prints, the fact that they went through enclosed spaces and over obstacles that would have caught or deflected any suspended object, or how a balloon could have maintained such a straight course for 100 miles on a night when wind would have caused irregular drift. The balloon theory requires assuming the prints were made by something dragging from a flying object, but the prints showed defined shapes pressing down into snow, not the smeared or erratic marks that dragging would create. The supernatural explanation that many witnesses embraced immediately was that Satan himself or a demon had walked through Devon that night. The hoof marks were his signature, his calling card, evidence that evil had a physical presence and had chosen to manifest in southern England for reasons that could only be terrifying. The Victorian era was religious and superstitious enough that this explanation was taken seriously by significant portions of the population. Churches were packed the following Sunday as people sought protection and understanding. Some refused to leave their homes after dark. The psychological impact was profound. An entire region had been confronted with physical evidence that something incomprehensible and potentially malevolent had moved through their communities while they slept. The hoax theory is inevitable. Perhaps someone or a group created the tracks deliberately to cause panic or confusion. But the logistics of creating a 100-mile trail of consistent prints across multiple communities, over rooftops and walls, in a single night without being observed by anyone, using a method that produced perfectly spaced, hoof-shaped impressions, defeats plausibility. The effort required would be enormous, the risk of discovery high, and the absence of any confession or evidence of the hoax in the subsequent century and a half suggests that if it was a hoax, it was executed with sophistication that exceeds almost any documented historical prank. Modern theories have proposed unusual weather phenomena, cyclones or atmospheric conditions that created patterns in the snow that looked like prints. But meteorological formations don't create discrete, hoof-shaped impressions spaced regularly. don't follow straight courses over varied terrain, and don't press into snow with the definition that witnesses described. Natural snow formations can create strange patterns, but they don't mimic the appearance of an animal track with such consistency that multiple observers in different locations describe them identically. Some researchers have suggested the tracks were made by multiple animals, that what appeared to be a continuous trail was actually several different sets of tracks from different creatures that coincidentally created a pattern that seemed connected. This might explain the distribution, but struggles with the consistency of description. Witnesses weren't describing vaguely similar tracks. They were describing identical tracks that appeared to be part of a single trail. Unless multiple creatures of the same species all decided to walk through Devon on the same night, following similar paths and producing identical prints, the coincidence required makes this explanation implausible. There are also theories involving experimental technology or vehicles that were being tested in the area and that created the tracks as a byproduct of their operation. Victorian England was the height of the Industrial Revolution, and secret experiments were certainly conducted. But what technology in 1855 could produce this effect? What device could traverse 100 miles, scale buildings, cross rivers, and leave precisely spaced hoof-like impressions without being seen or heard by anyone? The technology required seems far beyond what was available in that era, unless we assume classified development that was decades ahead of publicly known capabilities. The interdimensional theory proposes that the tracks were made by something not from our physical reality, but from an adjacent dimension or space that occasionally intersects with ours. If an entity from elsewhere passed through Devon that night, existing partially in our dimension and partially in its own, it might have left traces, physical impressions from whatever contact it made with our reality, while its actual form remained largely imperceptible to normal observation. This would explain why nothing was seen creating the tracks, why the tracks have characteristics that don't match any known creature, and why they appear to violate normal physics by going over obstacles without difficulty. The entity was moving through space that included both our dimension and others, and the tracks are the artifact of that movement impressing on our physical snow. The Devil's footprints were not unique to 1855. Similar phenomena have been reported in other times and places, though rarely with the documentation and witness scope of the Devon incident. In 1953, residents of Belgium reported mysterious tracks in snow that crossed improbable terrain and sparked similar speculation. Various reports from Russia, Scandinavia, and North America describe finding trails of prints that don't match known animals and that appear in locations or patterns that defy normal explanation. These subsequent incidents suggest the phenomenon isn't unique to Devon in 1855, but rather represents something that occurs rarely, but repeatedly, something that occasionally manifests and leaves physical traces before disappearing back into whatever state it normally occupies. The psychological residue of the Devil's footprints lingers in Devon to this day. The incident is part of local history, commemorated and debated, with residents aware that their region was the site of something that was never explained, that left evidence too substantial to dismiss, but too strange to categorize. The mystery has an official quality, documented in newspapers and letters from the time, impossible to relegate to pure folklore or legend. Because the primary sources exist, the contemporary accounts are too numerous and too consistent to ignore. What actually walked through Devon that February night remains unknown. Whether it was a creature unknown to science, an animal behaving in ways that don't match our understanding of animal behavior, a hoax executed with impossible sophistication, an atmospheric phenomenon that created illusions of purposeful tracks, a demonic entity leaving its mark on the physical world, an interdimensional traveler whose passage left impressions in our reality, or something else entirely that we lack the framework to even conceptualize. The tracks existed, were seen by hundreds of witnesses, were documented by credible sources, and have never been explained in ways that satisfy all the evidence. The prints covered over 100 miles, crossed obstacles that shouldn't be crossable, maintained consistency that shouldn't be achievable by any living creature moving through varied terrain, and then disappeared when the snow melted, leaving only the accounts and the persistent question of what could possibly create such a trail. The name Devil's Footprints reflects the immediate interpretation that something infernal had made them, that hooves in the snow could only mean one thing to a Christian population steeped in imagery of cloven-hoofed demons. But whether the interpretation was correct, whether something actually demonic walked through Devon, or whether the tracks came from a source that had nothing to do with religious concepts of evil, but that happened to create marks that matched those expectations, the incident remains as one of history's most documented and least explained anomalies. Something left tracks across southern England in 1855. Something walked or moved through multiple communities in a single night. Something impressed marks into fresh snow that looked like hooves, that followed straight lines across impossible distances and impossible obstacles, that have never been satisfactorily explained despite a century and a half of investigation and speculation. The Devil's Footprints walked through Devon once and left behind a mystery that endures because the evidence was too real to dismiss, too strange to explain, too consistent across too many witnesses to attribute to error or imagination, proving that sometimes the world produces phenomena that defy every attempt at rational explanation, that leave physical traces no theory can fully account for, that remain as permanent questions in the historical record, marks in the snow that melted away, but that the mystery they represent has never dissolved, has never been resolved, remains as vivid now as it was the morning residents of Devon looked out their windows and saw that something with hooves had walked through their world during the night, had left its signature across 100 miles of countryside, and had vanished before dawn without anyone seeing what made the marks. What walked with such inhuman consistency and such improbable ability to traverse obstacles? What left its calling card in the snow and then disappeared back into whatever realm it came from, leaving only the tracks, only the mystery, only the certainty that something happened that February night in 1855 that no one has ever managed to fully explain, something that walked where it shouldn't have been able to walk, left prints that shouldn't exist, and entered history as the Devil's Footprints, a name that captures both the appearance of the evidence and the terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what they were. What? The expressionless, the woman who wasn't human. In June of 1972, a woman was brought into the emergency room of Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles. That's how the story begins, unremarkable enough. Another patient arriving for treatment in a busy urban hospital on a summer night. But the staff who encountered her that evening would carry the memory for the rest of their lives, and some would refuse to ever speak about it again. The woman was wearing a blood-stained white gown, the kind patients wear during procedures, though no one knew which hospital it had come from, or how she'd gotten to the street where paramedics found her wandering. Her presence alone wasn't unusual. What made the staff's blood run cold was her face, or rather what she did with her face. She didn't blink, not once, not during the entire encounter. Her expression remained completely, utterly frozen, as if her facial muscles had been paralyzed, or as if whatever was wearing that body didn't understand how human faces were supposed to work. The paramedics who brought her in reported something was wrong from the moment they made contact. She had been standing motionless in the middle of an intersection, cars swerving around her, drivers honking and shouting. but she didn't react to any of it. When they approached and asked if she needed help, she turned toward them with mechanical precision, her entire body rotating as a single unit rather than just her head. Her eyes locked onto them, but there was nothing behind them, no recognition, no fear, no emotion of any kind. Just a terrible emptiness that made them want to step back, even as their training pushed them forward. She didn't speak, didn't resist when they guided her to the ambulance, didn't respond to their questions during the drive. She simply sat, staring forward, that frozen expression never changing, her chest rising and falling in breath. But nothing else moving, nothing else suggesting life as they understood it. The emergency room was crowded that night, the usual chaos of trauma and illness, staff moving between patients with practiced efficiency. When the woman was wheeled in, something shifted in the atmosphere. People noticed her and then tried very hard not to look at her directly. There's something deeply disturbing about a human face that doesn't move, that doesn't perform the tiny unconscious adjustments we all make moment to moment. We blink to moisturize our eyes, to reset our vision, to respond to stimuli. We make micro expressions even when we think our faces are still. Our features shift with breathing, with thinking, with the simple act of being conscious. This woman did none of that. Her face was a mask, but the mask was flesh, and something looked out through eyes that didn't move, didn't track, didn't focus the way eyes should. A nurse approached to take her vitals and immediately felt the wrongness intensify. The woman's skin was cold, far colder than it should be for someone who'd been walking around outside in summer. Her pulse was there, but wrong, too slow and too regular, beating with mechanical precision, rather than the slight variations that characterize a living heart responding to breath and movement and nervous system fluctuations. When the nurse tried to ask basic questions, name, date of birth, medical history, the woman didn't respond at all. She simply stared, that expression locked in place, mouth slightly open but not moving, eyes fixed on something the nurse couldn't see or in a direction that didn't quite make sense given where she was looking. Then the smell hit. Several staff members reported it independently, describing it the same way, even though they were interviewed separately after the incident. It wasn't the smell of infection or decay or any medical condition they recognized. It was chemical, sterile, but wrong, like formaldehyde mixed with something else they couldn't identify. It seemed to come from the woman herself, from her breath or her skin, growing stronger the closer anyone got to her. One orderly later said it reminded him of a biology lab, of preserved specimens, of things that used to be alive but had been arrested in some intermediate state between life and death. The attending physician who examined her found nothing that made medical sense. Her pupils didn't respond to light. When he shone his pen light into them, they remained fixed and dilated, no constriction, no reaction at all. Her reflexes were absent. Tapping her knee produced no kick. Touching her cornea with a wisp of cotton, which should produce an automatic blink, resulted in nothing. It was as if the basic neurological responses that operate below conscious control simply weren't present. Yet she was breathing, her heart was beating, she maintained posture and muscle tone. She wasn't comatose or brain dead. She was awake in some sense, present in some way, but operating according to rules that didn't match human physiology. While the physician was conducting his examination, puzzled and increasingly disturbed, the woman moved. Not gradually, not with the natural flow of human motion, but instantaneously, the way an image changes when a video skips frames. One moment, she was sitting still. The next moment, she was standing, though no one saw her transition between the two positions. Staff members who witnessed it couldn't explain what they'd seen. couldn't reconcile the movement with their understanding of how bodies work in space. She had been here, then she was there, and the in-between seemed to be missing. She began walking toward the exit, her gait wrong in ways that were hard to articulate. The legs moved, the feet touched the floor in the right sequence, but something about the rhythm was off, too smooth or too jerky, lacking the natural bounce and sway that comes from a skeleton connected by joints and animated by muscles and tendons. A security guard moved to intercept her, to guide her back to the examination area, since she hadn't been cleared to leave. When he reached out to touch her shoulder, she stopped instantly, as if someone had pressed a pause button. Then, slowly, she turned her head, and for the first time since arriving, her expression changed. Her mouth opened wider, far wider than should be comfortable, the jaw hinging in a way that suggested the bone structure underneath wasn't quite right. Inside, her teeth looked normal enough, but there were too many of them. Or they were arranged wrong. Or something about the inside of her mouth created an optical illusion that made people's eyes refuse to focus properly. The security guard stepped back, his hand dropping away without making contact. Later, he would have trouble describing exactly what he'd seen. The memory felt slippery, as if his brain didn't want to retain it, as if the image of that opened mouth and whatever was inside it violated something fundamental about his understanding of reality. The woman closed her mouth and continued toward the exit. Staff members parted for her, no one quite willing to physically restrain her, some instinct warning them that touching this thing would be a terrible mistake. She moved through the emergency room doors and into the night. 2 security guards followed at a distance, maintaining visual contact while calling for backup. They watched her walk through the parking lot with that same mechanical gait, heading toward the street. Then, in the space between streetlights, in the shadow cast by the building, she simply wasn't there anymore. The guards both saw it, both would swear to it in their reports. She didn't run, didn't hide behind anything, didn't turn a corner. She was walking, visible in their sight, and then the darkness seemed to fold around her and she was gone, as if she'd stepped through a door only she could see. Hospital administration tried to handle the incident quietly. There was no record of her admission in the system. The paperwork the paramedics had initiated disappeared. Staff members were told in unclear terms not to discuss what they'd seen, not with other hospitals, not with the police, not with anyone outside the facility. Most complied, not because they were ordered to, but because they didn't want to revisit what had happened, didn't want to think too carefully about what that woman might have been. A few spoke years later, anonymously, their accounts collected by researchers interested in unexplained phenomena. The details they provided were disturbingly consistent, despite having no contact with each other since the incident. The paramedics who picked her up tried to find where she'd come from. The intersection where they found her was residential, no hospitals nearby, no medical facilities that would explain the gown she wore. They canvassed the area, asking if anyone had seen her before that night. No one had. It was as if she'd materialized in that intersection with no history, no origin point, no trail leading backward to explain her presence. Checking with other hospitals about missing patients yielded nothing. No facility reported anyone matching her description walking away from treatment or escaping from psychiatric care. One theory that circulated quietly among staff was that she was a test subject who'd escaped from some classified medical experiment. Los Angeles had military facilities, research laboratories, places where things happened that weren't made public. Maybe she was a victim of some procedure that had gone wrong, some treatment that had altered her in ways that made her seem less than human. The blood on her gown suggested injury or surgery. The chemical smell suggested exposure to preservatives or experimental compounds. Her complete lack of affect and bizarre movements could result from neurological damage or psychological trauma so profound that her mind had fractured. But this theory required believing that whatever facility she came from had allowed her to escape and then made no effort to retrieve her, had left no trace in their communications or missing person reports, had simply written her off despite representing what must have been significant investment in whatever they were doing to her. The alternative explanations were worse, that she wasn't human at all, but something wearing human form imperfectly, getting the details almost right, but missing the subtle elements that make us recognize each other as living beings. That she was a puppet operated by intelligence that didn't fully understand the body it was controlling, animating it according to rules that didn't match our physics or our biology. That she had been human once, but had become something else, something that existed in the space between life and death, preserved and mobile, but no longer alive in any meaningful sense. Every explanation led to implications that were deeply disturbing. Questions about what kinds of things might walk among us, unrecognized, what purposes they might serve, what it means that they can disappear so completely when observed. In the years since, other stories have surfaced of similar encounters. A patient in a Chicago hospital in the 80s, a woman found wandering in Seattle in the 90s, isolated incidents separated by time and geography, but sharing core details. The expressionless face, the mechanical movements, the sense that something is looking out through human eyes without understanding how to properly animate the features, the chemical smell, the sudden disappearance. These reports are anecdotal, unverified, passed through internet forums and paranormal discussion boards, where truth and fiction mix freely. They could all be variants of an urban legend, a story that resonates because it taps into primal fears about recognition and invasion, about things that look like us but aren't, about the possibility that the face we see might not match what's underneath. But the 1972 incident at Cedars-Sinai involved multiple trained witnesses, medical professionals who understood physiology and psychology, people whose job was to remain calm in the face of injury and death. What they encountered that night violated their professional knowledge and their personal sense of reality. They saw something that shouldn't exist, that operated according to principles that didn't match human biology, that left no trace in hospital records or administrative files, but left permanent marks in the memories of everyone who looked into those unblinking eyes. The woman, if that's what she was, is still out there somewhere. Or she's gone, dissolved back into whatever realm produced her. Or she never existed at all outside the collective trauma response of overworked emergency room staff, experiencing something that had rational explanation but seemed impossible in the moment. The story persists because it speaks to something we recognize instinctively, that awareness we all have, that we know what a human looks like, how humans move, how they respond and react. And when something appears that gets the details, almost right but not quite. When the face is wrong in ways we can sense but not articulate, when the movements violate the subtle patterns we've spent our entire lives unconsciously learning. Every instinct screams that we're looking at something that shouldn't be, something dangerous, something that walks in our shape but isn't us at all. The expressionless stands as a reminder that recognition can fail, that the familiar form might contain the utterly foreign, and that sometimes the scariest thing isn't what's hidden in darkness, but what stands directly in front of us, wearing a face that refuses to be quite human enough.